I was spending the summer living out of a tent in a Michigan state park. I know that sounds bad. I had a job that summer, but I was going through some things and couldn't afford any decent housing close enough to work. I didn't have a car at the time, so I was limited to places I could bike to and from work. Luckily, the park was close enough and they gave me a discount on a long-term campsite. If I'm honest, the park facilities were a lot nicer than some of the apartments I looked at in town. I mean, public showers definitely weren't my favorite, but I could have done worse that year. The park was pretty nice. Most of it was wooded. There were 2 lakes and 3 campgrounds. 2 of the campgrounds were near the 2 lakes, and the third was situated between where the forest met a small prairie. This was the campground I set up in. There was enough shade from the trees nearby, and I'd get the breeze rolling off the open prairie. Plus, it was a little quieter than the campsites, but the lake. There was a marshy area just beyond the prairie that brought out some bugs, but nothing a citronella candle couldn't take care of. It was a pretty nice setup. I liked it. Living there, I got to know the park staff pretty well. So when something was up, I could tell. I heard about a couple of campers that had issues with a deer, believe it or not. Apparently, it tried to break through their tent in the middle of the night. They could hear hoofbeats outside and saw the shape of antlers ramming the tent fabric. I wasn't quite sure what to make of that, but I never had any problems. There is also someone carving strange runes into trees in random places, but we all just attributed that to some people being weirdos. There was a reward out for any information leading to the culprit, since carving up trees at the state park was technically vandalism. It wasn't a big reward, but I was hard up for cash that year, so I did some sleuthing around, but I didn't find anything. Other than that, I, myself, didn't see anything strange, but the park staff knew something they didn't want to talk about. I asked around and none of them would give details, but just said there had been encounters. Encounters with what? I don't know. They wouldn't tell me. Some weeks, they would close certain sections of the campgrounds or certain trails. There didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it. They did permanently close the trail leading to the marsh, but with all the mosquitoes over there, I don't think anybody missed it. I finally asked what was going on, and they said they had been having some issues with wildlife. But like I said, I had gotten to know these people pretty well, and I knew they were lying. I went to the ranger I knew the best and asked point blank, was it safe for me to stay in the park? He said honestly that he didn't know. No one had been injured, but people had been reporting seeing strange beings. They were having a team come in later that week and test the area for anything that might make people hallucinate, because the stories they were telling them were all absolutely insane. But every story had one thing in common, that it was something evil living in the marsh. He said everyone described it a little different, but they all said it came out of the marsh. I tried pressing him for more information, but I could tell he just didn't know what to say to me. A team of scientists did come and test the area when I was there. They asked me a whole bunch of questions since I had been staying there long term, but nothing came of it. They didn't find anything. It was about a week later that the park ranger came and told me they needed to close the park for 1, maybe 2 days, and that I had to find somewhere else to go during that time. Well, I didn't have anywhere else to go, and I was saving for a car, so I didn't want to blow any money on a hotel. I know this is bad, but I decided to stash my bike nearby and camp off trail and just hope I wouldn't get caught. I found a spot close enough to the road that I could hike in and out from there to get to work, but it was hidden enough that I thought no one would see me. I did have to pass the marsh, but I wasn't too worried about it. I should have been, but I wasn't. It was pretty late by the time I finished my shift, and I had to bike in after dark. I didn't want to use my flashlight in case any of the rangers were there overnight for some reason. They wouldn't say why they were closing the park, but I assumed something was going on. There were several black vans in parking lot by the main office when I left. Retelling this story out loud, I feel like such an idiot. I should have known something was out there and that I should have just listened to the ranger, but I was young and dumb and thought I'd be fine. I made it safely back to my camp in the dark, but just as I got there, I heard something scream. It wasn't a human sound, and it was coming from the direction of the marsh. I saw lights on the hill and heard human voices nearby. I crawled through the grass towards them to see what was going on. It took me a while to get there, but I made it all the way to the marsh without being seen. There were at least a dozen men in tactical gear, like bulletproof vests and guns. They didn't have any type of uniform that I recognized. They were surrounding the marsh with spotlights pointed towards it. It was quiet for a moment before something moved under the water. The only thing I could see was what looked like the points of deer antlers poking out of the swamp. The moved like it was swimming underwater, and suddenly the men with guns all open fired. It was so bright I thought I saw daylight for a second. Everything went quiet again. 2 of the men waded into the water to retrieve whatever they had shot to pieces. I don't even know how to describe it. They pulled it out with a rope. It looked like a person but had the antlers of a deer. Its limbs were long, too long to be human, and its fingers looked like claws. Its face was pretty shot up, but it looked like it had a snout at one point. I have no idea what it was or what to even compare it to. The park opened as usual the next day. The black vehicles were nowhere to be seen, and the marsh trail was open to the public again. I asked the ranger why the park had been closed, and he told me that the scientists found some chemical in the marsh that had been making people hallucinate, and they had to neutralize it. He reassured me the park was safe again, and that was that. I wanted to ask more questions, but I was sure he would have told me I had hallucinated the whole thing. But I can tell you for certain that those were no scientists treating some chemical in the marsh. My sighting happened back in the summertime of 2013. My uncle and I were up fishing on a river near Mont.Apaca in Quebec. We parked our truck at the end of a road, went down into the woods, and hiked upstream for about 1 mile or so. It was around 1 p.m. in the afternoon. We had just caught some walleye, so we stopped to have lunch under a big willow that hung out over the river. It was very relaxing, and we were enjoying the warmth of the sun. The willow tree provided a nice little bit of shade, so we set up our chairs under it and ate our sandwiches. We were filthy and dirty from fishing. I had just taken a bite when I looked up and saw this thing standing on 2 legs roughly 40 feet away from us. It was moving in a really weird way, which I can only describe as being like a bear looks when it walks upright, but not quite as jerky. It wasn't looking at me or anything, but its eyes seemed to be focused behind me. I assumed that whatever it was after was running off in our direction, but now had disappeared into the woods. The thing seemed to be on a mission. At least that's how I understood it, and at this point I actually did just think it was a bear and was happy that it was now gone. After eating, I walked upstream in the direction it disappeared, when I heard something large charging through the woods coming towards me very fast from downstream. The first thing that ran through my mind was it's either a large buck or a bear, so I stood frozen thinking, crap, this is not going to be good. Fortunately, it just came right past me and my uncle, who had also come to the river to wash his hands. I could now see it clearly. This huge wolf biped came rushing at us, but then passed right by us. It was full-on chasing this huge game that was going by. A large elk. Actually, there were 2 elk, 1 large bull and a smaller cow. The wolf creature gave pursuit to the larger one. My uncle stood there stiff as a board, and you could hear him breathing behind me. He was completely terrified. Okay, I was too. The elk, both of them, ran into the trees right by where we had parked and eaten. Then, this wolf went past us too and over to that same spot in a rush after them. It disappeared into the woods about 100 or so feet from us, but it didn't stop. You could still hear it running, giving chase, while also snorting loudly as it continued off in the woods. I don't think it saw us crouched down beneath the willow tree originally. Then everything got silent again, and that was the tip-off. That's when we knew we weren't alone. There was another one of these things watching us, a much bigger one, the alpha male. I could hear it breathing heavily, and there was a large cluster of fallen trees right beside us, so I crouched down between some dead wood and I could see where it was. It was staring at us with its head slightly cocked to one side. It stayed perfectly still. It looked unlike the other one that was shaggier and wolf-like. This one was completely black and much more muscularly built. It made this very odd sound that reminded me of cattle, but on a much deeper scale. My uncle saw it next and he screamed out to me, "We have to go now!" Now that caught my attention because my uncle is usually very calm. So we just threw our stuff in and jumped into his truck, pretty much leaving behind our fishing gear. I knew what this thing was, but I just couldn't figure out why it would be here in this place. There were 3 more of them already emerging from the trees near where they ran after the 2 elk. I didn't want to think about what else was out here. We got in the truck and drove off back down the road until we came to the paved state road, which would lead us back to town. The city is about 60 miles east from where we went fishing and straight south. When we returned home, I explained to my mother what had happened, as well as some family friends who were interested in hearing about it. They had also apparently heard rumors of a bizarre bipedal wolf living up around that mountain. To this day, I don't exactly have a clue as to what on earth we encountered, even though I had a faint idea, or at least I thought I did. But whatever these animals are, they did not like that we invaded their hunting territory. I took a job that had me working the night shift. I didn't really mind too much. The sleep schedule change was a bit of a challenge at first, but I got used to it. The drive to and from work was a lot less complicated with fewer cars on the road. If I had to make that same trip during the day, I would certainly be stuck in rush hour as soon as I crossed the bridge, and my drive was an hour one way as it was. I should probably explain that I live in a pretty rural area, but I work in the nearest large city. So my commute takes me through some woods, some farmlands, and then into the suburbs and finally the city. The drive goes pretty quick at night. I usually put on a podcast or an audiobook, and I'm there in no time. One night I was driving home around 3 a.m. I was just about in the area where the suburbs fall away into the countryside. I wasn't quite to farm country yet, but I was getting close. I saw an amber light in the distance over what looked like an open field. It definitely wasn't a house or anything, but it was hard to tell as I was watching the road. The light glowed for maybe a minute before going dark again. It was too bright to be a house light and way too expansive to be a light from a vehicle. It looked like the swath of light you'd get from super bright street lamp, but it was in the middle of a field. Something deep in my gut told me to stop the car and find a way to turn around, but I was on the freeway and it was easier to keep driving. I definitely knew there was something wrong or odd. I didn't know what, but I knew I didn't want to be there. I was getting closer to the light. It was definitely in a farm field. It would flash on for a minute and then go dark again. My brain told me it must be some type of farm vehicle, but I knew that just wasn't the case. As I got closer, the whole field lit up, and there no source of the light that I could see. It was the strangest thing I've ever experienced. I pulled over along the edge of the freeway when I reached the field. It was dark when I stopped. I didn't hear anything odd. I didn't smell anything. There appeared to be nothing wrong besides this mysterious light. I probably sat there on the side of the road for 5 minutes before the light flashed again. There was a white-tailed deer standing there under the light, along with a few cows. I finally recognized the area. It was a local dairy farm. The animals under the light all looked distressed and confused. I still couldn't figure out where the light was coming from, but it seemed to light up the whole field at that point. And then suddenly, the deer disappeared right in front of me. Completely disappeared. It looked like it got sucked down into the earth. It was gone. And then the light went out. I hurriedly put my car in drive, and then the light came again. This time, 3 of the cows got sucked down. They were there one moment and just gone the next. The earth didn't open up. There was no sinkhole, just grass. And the cows were just sucked down. That's the only way I can explain it that makes sense. But the cows disappeared and the light went out again. I drove the hell out of there before the light could come back. I think I was going about 120 the rest of the way home. It was the most terrifying drive of my life. I kept looking in the rearview mirror to see if the light would show up. It messed me up. I called in sick for nearly a week before I could drive that stretch of road again. I still don't like driving past it, even in the daylight. I heard later that other people saw it too. Not just there in that cow pasture, but they saw it other places around. And that dairy farmer, he had been complaining that something was attacking his cows. He thought it was wolves. I didn't know what to tell him, so I didn't say anything. I mean, what would I even say? Your cows disappeared into the grown under some strange orange light at 3 a.m. He wouldn't have believed me anyway. This happened only last year. I don't know where those cows went, but I think about it every night. I haven't seen the light since that night. I ended up switching to a day shift so I didn't have to make that drive at night ever again. I was having panic attacks just thinking about it. If anyone else has ever seen the lights, please tell your story so I know I'm not crazy. Here, in the remotest parts of this land, we don't see much at night. However, I feel compelled to write about an incident that happened back in autumn of 2002. Something that has disturbed me ever since and made me feel afraid to sleep or even leave my house for a long time. I was living in a farmhouse with my new husband and daughter. My daughter at the time was only around 6 months old, and she kept waking during the night. I would have to get up with her at least once every night to settle her, feed her, and pacify her. At times, I would sing a lullaby in the kitchen as I cradled her, and I would look out at the empty apartment blocks. Mostly I liked looking at the small communal garden we were given as a grant from the government. On one occasion, my husband made a joke that my lullaby would attract criminals to the apartment complex. It was quite a haunting tune, he said. It was a tune that my own grandmother had sung to me, and she left me the words on a little sheet of paper. She always told me that it kept evil spirits away and would protect the crops from any scourges. I was not aware that it sounded haunting because I was so used to it, and honestly, soothed by it. But occasionally as I sang it to my daughter, I would see little flickers of light out in the other windows of the apartment complex, as if people had awoken to my singing. On this particular night, I was singing the lullaby, and then heard a screeching sound from the small garden outside. Walking over to my window, still singing the lullaby, I saw something that nearly made me drop my daughter. This creature, something that was not human, was something I'd never seen, and it was like it was staring at me. Red eyes, but slits, almost. It appeared to be the size and shape of a hyena, and that was really the only creature it reminded me of. It was brown and had kind of a long tail, but what was most peculiar was that the creature had large wings. They kind of extended outwards like a huge web, and it was really pale on the inside. It was bizarre and frighteningly ugly. I covered my daughter's eyes, but I had a feeling that she had glimpsed it. Its face was weird too. It was kind of goblin fox-like, and it had strange features and was terrifying and demonic. I tried to call for my husband, but words would not leave my mouth. I was totally perplexed by this creature that was sitting in the garden just yards away. I felt sick and troubled. Where had this creature come from? What did it want from me? These were all questions that stirred in my mind. And eventually I managed to back away from the window and walk up the stairs. I awoke my husband, who totally believed me and came down with a raised baseball bat. When we got down to the window, the creature had gone. We debated calling the police, but we decided not to. We didn't want to make the police think that I was off my rocker and a threat or danger to my child. All I know is there are wild and not so wonderful creatures in the animal kingdom. Things that even the most explorative environmentalists can't comprehend. Whatever it was, I saw it with my own 2 eyes. And because it was so disturbing, I have lived a life fraught with tensions and anxiety ever since. My daughter, too, has now encountered problems of her own. Now 20, she still experiences night terrors and calls me in panic if she is home alone. It's as if that memory has been etched into her brain, but I have never brought it to fruition. I have never discussed it with her, but it's definitely affecting her. Now, we stayed at that apartment for 2 years after the incident, and any time I had to wake during the night to go to the kitchen, I would feel dread, expecting to see this thing out there again. I feared it was waiting to reappear and resurface those horrible memories. Thank goodness my husband came down with me every time after that, and luckily as my daughter got older, I had to do it less and less. Anyway, it never did surface again, and that was the only time I would see it. I grew up in the woods of northern Minnesota. There are things out there in the wild lands that locals don't like to talk about. Small town secrets, I suppose. Most of them were harmless. Others, not so much. The area I lived in was about as far north as you could get before you crossed over into Canada. The nearest town had less than 100 people, including my family. As a kid, we had all these rules. Everybody's family had them. My parents said it was to keep us safe from predators. Don't go out after dark. Don't go into the woods alone. And if you smell something dead, get away and get inside as quick as you can. There's probably a bear nearby protecting its kill. We had wolves, black bears, and mountain lions in the area, so it made perfect sense to us. Everybody's parents had the same rules. I mean, my backyard was practically a bear highway if there was such a thing. It would be easy to have an encounter go bad if you weren't careful. There were 2 stories of people disappearing in the town. Both were attributed to incidents with wildlife. One was a man out alone in the woods. It was the 1920s or 30s, if my memory serves. He lived pretty far out there in the woods. The cabin he built for himself has since been torn down, but the foundation is still there if you know where to look. Anyway, the story I heard was that he didn't show up for work one day, and when they went to check on him, they found the door to his cabin left open but no sign of him anywhere. They searched around the cabin and could smell what they thought was a carcass, but they couldn't find it. They looked everywhere but couldn't find the source of the smell. His death was blamed on a black bear. They figured the bear cached his body somewhere, explaining the smell. Predatory black bears attacks are rare, but they do happen. The other incident was of a kid in the year 1983, walking home from friend's house alone. It was only about a mile walk, but the roadway passed through the woods. Kid never made it there. That's the story everybody's parents always used to scare them into following the rules. The investigation couldn't find any trace of that kid or what happened. They found what looked like moose tracks near the area, but that was it. No other predators. To be honest, it could have been a moose. Those things are dangerous. However, I think it was something else entirely. When I was about 12 years old, I was best friends with the neighbor girl. The easiest way to get to her house was a deer trail that started in my backyard and ran about a half mile through the woods. My parents were very strict with me about the rules. I wasn't allowed to use the trail after dusk. I had to tell them when I was leaving and had to call them from my friend's house as soon as I arrived. And I had to carry bear spray at all times. I had run into bears before out there without a problem. Normally you just yell and wave your arms and they run away. It's only when they have cubs that you need to worry. But I kept my bear spray close. Always. There was one day that I was walking home on the trail. It was at least an hour before dusk, I know that much. If I was out even near dusk, I would have been in so much trouble. I probably wouldn't have been allowed to leave my room until high school graduation. That's how serious the rules were. I thought the rules were to protect me from bears, but that wasn't it at all. There's something else that lives in the woods up there, and it's a lot more dangerous than a black bear. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it got. A sudden silence just washed itself over the woods. It was like I was in a movie and someone pushed mute. I remember seeing leaves blowing in the wind, but I couldn't hear them moving. That's when I smelled it. It was the foulest thing I have smelled in my life, and I've walked up on near week-old roadkill. This was worse. It was definitely the stench of something dead, but there was something else there too. Like if you've ever smelled a really bad infection. That's the best I can describe it. I immediately knew I was in trouble. My parents said if I ever smelled anything dead, there was likely a predator nearby. I pulled the safety stopper off the trigger of the bear spray I was carrying and held it up in front of me. I remember I pulled my shirt up over my nose, hoping the material would somehow stifle the smell. Then I looked out at the trail ahead of me. There was a tiny rabbit sitting there out in the open. Its eyes were wide and it was shivering, but it didn't move. I don't know why it didn't just run. I heard something moving behind me, something walking. They were hoofbeats. I had my bear spray in my hand, ready to use it in case it was a moose. I turned around and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was about the size of an elk. It had the body of an elk and the antlers of an elk. Full antlers, even in the summer. Its hair was peeling off, exposing areas of raw flesh and even the bones underneath. It was leaking from its wounds. There were flies buzzing around it like it was a corpse. It definitely smelled like a corpse, but it seemed to have no trouble walking. I pointed the bear spray at its face and then I froze. It had no face. Its head was a bare skull, bone white. The skin was hanging loose around its neck. The skull was stripped completely bare. It had no eyes, no nose. It walked straight past me like I wasn't even there and went straight for the rabbit. The stupid rabbit didn't even try to run. The undead elk grabbed it with its teeth and threw it up in the air like a coyote does and then swallowed it whole. It might have not had eyes or a nose, but it did appear to have a tongue. Its jaw cracked when it opened its mouth. After watching it make quick work of the rabbit, I ran. I didn't want to stay and find out what it might do to me. As soon as I saw it, I knew this was the creature responsible for the disappearances. It had to be, and I wasn't going to be its next victim. The only form of defense I had was the bear spray. I don't imagine it would work on this thing. I never took that trail through the woods again. My parents caught on as soon as I started asking them to drive me to my friend's house instead of walk. They asked me if I saw it, and I said yes. And that was the end of the conversation. They never told me what it was, and I never asked. There are things you just don't talk about in towns like this.